ever heard somebody start telling a story, and as the story progresses, you realize, I think I've heard something like that before, but it's not really that they're retelling another story. They're actually telling a story that you've lived through. That commonality of a story that you think, that sounds just like my life.
Welcome to Leading Leaders Podcast. 5-minute videos, 5 days a week.
I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. Last week I had a chance to do an interview, and for the podcast, the guy talks about money and leadership and things of that nature, and he said, tell me how STORYPOWER works in leadership. So I gave him some examples, and I gave him some basic tips, some of the same stuff we teach in the STORYPOWER Masterclass. And I said, really story is both a read and a write tool. And as I gave him some examples, he said, well, so you mean like word pictures? But he didn't use the word word pictures. He said he wasn't familiar with that phrase. But he talked about how to tell a story and make people feel like they were standing in the same place and they could see the same things. And as we talked about that, I said, the challenge with word pictures is that maybe I've had the same visual experience. Maybe I've even walked down the same road. I've been in the same place. But I didn't feel the same way about that occasion that you did. The deer and the hunter, they lived through exactly the same moment. They had totally different stories about what just happened here. The idea that you tell a story with word pictures really kind of sets you up, in my opinion, for the that everyone thinks and feels, has the same perspective, the same emotion, the same attitude about that story that you do. Maybe someone lived through that same moment and they felt exactly about that moment like you did. It was just as exciting, just as enthralling, just as invigorating, just as encouraging as it was for you. Maybe somebody lived through exactly the same moment and they came out of it feeling like they'd been taken advantage of. Like they were a victim, not empowered, but disempowered. See, the challenge with stories, and where we have to be really careful with stories, is sometimes we superimpose our own emotions, our own thoughts, our own experiences in the stories, in the anecdotes that we use. We superimpose those onto someone else. We presume that the way we felt about the story is exactly how they're going to feel about the story. And that's not always the case. Not only is it not always the case, sometimes it's emotionally wounding. Meaning, your feel great to you, but harmful to someone else. I'll give you a really quick and minor example of this. I remember talking to my friends one time about the idea of the world being more like Mayberry. And in my mind, that's a small town America where life was simple and all the neighbors knew each other and they always waved at each other. And if your kids were in trouble or your kids got hurt on their bicycle, everybody in town knew where to take them right back home. And they knew which home it was. And everything was simple and everyone was friendly and everything was awesome. And I made that comment, and an African-American friend of mine looked at me and said, how many black people lived in Mayberry? And I thought, well, that's just a silly question. I mean, I don't know. He said, well, how many were on the show? I can't think of any. He said there were one or two, but he said, if you're not black looking at Mayberry, you don't look at it the same way. He said, I look at that time and I remember a time of being in peril because my skin was dark. I remember a time of living with the threat of death if I tried to go to a public school or use the wrong water fountain or got on the wrong seat in the bus. See, same event, same time in life, same era, same story. Completely different feeling. And with racism, that one's pretty obvious. It's pretty easy to pick out. But, if you've ever smelled burnt coffee, maybe your only thought is somebody in the office left the pot out too long when they were trying to refill a cup too fast. But for someone else, that's the smell of burnt beans, which would get them beaten by an abusive father. See, your stories, they're not just your story. They're moments in life that other people have lived through as well. And you certain emotions, but you're conjuring emotions for somebody else. In the power of storytelling, understand that your hope is to bring people into a moment where they look and feel about the story the same way you do, where they have a very similar perspective, where they have a very similar set of emotions, so they can walk through the other side and get your point, get the illustration, and be a part of the teaching. But if you're just telling stories because it makes you look good or makes you feel good, you better ask yourself, does everyone hearing me tell this story feel the same way about the story that I do? I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast, or Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.